Finally, the deal is done.
It's about time.
Microsoft has acquired Activision for $69 billion. That is an insane amount of money. Congratulations to Microsoft and all the teams at Activision. I can't wait to see how this turns out. I've been on this adventure before, and it's a unique experience every time. No two acquisitions are alike, and you just never know how it's going to work out. Microsoft will be doubling their Xbox team size and acquiring some of the most beloved franchises in gaming. A lot of times during acquisition, the part people get really excited about is the $69 billion and what are all the cool games we're getting. Those things are important, but I think the key thing about this acquisition that is going to be the most difficult and the most interesting is the people. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be making these games.
When I think about where we're trying to go, it always starts with the teams.
It's not a surprise that Bobby Kotick is out. In an acquisition like this, there was zero chance Bobby was staying unless Microsoft had something really amazing for him to work on. Say, letting him run Microsoft, or maybe letting him run the entire Xbox team. They weren't going to do that, so when I heard he was leaving, I wasn't surprised. It does appear his leaving will be a win for Xbox, at least in the short term. It seems employees are blaming Kotick for everything that is wrong with the company. It's also natural when a leader leaves for them to get blamed for everything. To be clear, it happens whether it's deserved or not. Of course, you can only shift the blame to the old leader for a few months, but it will buy Phil and his team a little breathing room as they try to acclimate everybody to their new situation. Phil and his team have been making the rounds and meeting all of the teams. In a merger like this, the focus has to be on the people. It's also possible they've already talked to key members before the acquisition was complete. For example, they promoted two of their leaders to president while the deal was still being discussed. I bet that Bobby and Phil spoke about these promotions, at least informally. Let me explain. When I decided to leave Microsoft in 2008, I was having meetings with Warner Brothers. They were trying to convince me to join the company and become a vice president of their Seattle studios. They wanted to acquire a bunch of studios and really kickstart their gaming efforts, and they were asking me to come and help them do that. It was pretty exciting. I was talking to them. I needed to finish shipping Gears of War. I was never going to leave in the middle of shipping Gears of War 2. There's just no way I would do that to a game team. It's not fair to the team. Lucky for me, WB agreed with that, and so we took our time. We had a lot of different meetings, and during those meetings, I found out that they were acquiring Snowblind. They were working on War in the North, which was a Lord of the Rings game. Given that the deal was likely to close, WB had me meet with team leaders at Snowblind before making me an offer. I admired that they did that. It was smart and kind to everyone involved. I'm guessing that Xbox also did what's called a due diligence on all of the different teams at Activision. Part of that would be discussing who the key people were on all of the teams. And I'm not just talking about the leaders. They're important for sure. But I'm talking about your core engineer or your amazing artist or your great designer working in the middle of Blizzard. These are the people that you want to know who they are, and you want to spend a little bit of time talking with them and getting them excited about sticking around. Because if you make the acquisition happen and then you lose the entire team, you're going to have a real problem. It'll be very difficult to ship your games. I was involved in this process at Warner Brothers, and then again when I worked at Oculus. When I joined Oculus, Oculus was being bought by Facebook, and they were about to close the deal when Oculus decided they would make an acquisition. So we were being acquired, and we decided to acquire someone, and that company was called Carbon. I remember this really well because I was mowing my lawn on a Saturday, and I got a text message from the head of Carbon Design asking me to call him. I, of course, knew Oculus was working with Carbon because they had been working with them for a while, but I hadn't spent a lot of time on the product side. It was in the research group. Since I had no idea what the owner wanted, I jumped on the phone with Nate, and he told me about the acquisition and said, look, the deal is coming together fast. Since you're local and you have experience with acquisitions, I need you to do me a favor. Can you go over tomorrow and talk with some of the key people at Carbon Design and convince them that this is a great place to work and answer any of their questions? So I did. I spent all day Sunday with their team. They were some of the most talented and fun people I have ever met. They were a dream team. Their working culture was cool because they embedded their industrial design team with the electrical and mechanical engineering teams, and they worked in tandem on all of their products. This meant that design was able to impact the product from the start of the process. You never end up with a Duke controller, the giant Xbox controller that everybody made fun of. You don't end up with that if you have everybody integrated from the start. The problem with the Duke controller was that the circuit board was done before the people making the industrial design and figuring out the ergonomics of the controller were even invited to participate in the process. I loved Oculus, so it wasn't hard for me to get the Carbon team excited about the prospect of joining, and they did. All of those key members signed on and stayed until after we launched. I think that Microsoft may have done something similar also with their Bethesda acquisition. Pete Hines, the head of Bethesda, recently announced he was leaving after 24 years. As a rule, companies don't talk about employee contracts, so we'll likely never know exactly what happened. But it's possible Pete was contractually obligated to stay through the launch of Starfield. Or he might have had certain financial incentives compelling him to stay, at least until the integration was done. Hopefully, Xbox has convinced the talented team members to stay at least for a while. It's rough to integrate cultures, and you need people signed on to help lead the team through that tough transition. Let's talk about what culture is. It's a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or an organization. It's inevitable that there are going to be cultural challenges during this integration. It doesn't matter how much you think the companies are the same. It doesn't matter how much you've loved talking to each other and you feel like, wow, this is a match made in heaven. There are going to be challenges when you try to integrate the two teams. Not only among the large organization, but also the subcultures of each team and studio. Navigating those differences will be a big challenge, and many of the decisions will make or break a studio. First, we'll talk about the really boring, critical operational challenges. For every person working at Activision, they are going to be like a new employee for the next couple of months. They're going to be figuring out their health insurance and all of the benefits that Microsoft has, and if they were given some kind of a stock package, how that works, and when they're allowed to sell it. All of these questions have to be answered. And it's boring stuff, but it is really, really hard to be going through that and trying to ship a game at the same time. It's a lot like your first day at a new job. If that wasn't enough, they will also encounter differences in simple things. For example, buying hardware. After Oculus was onboarded at Facebook, we ran into this when we wanted to buy a high-end gaming rig. Not only was it difficult to order, none of the IT people in the Facebook Seattle building could support us. If it wasn't a laptop, they weren't able to help. I remember my engineering lead receiving the machine he had ordered, and it was in pieces. The hard drive wasn't in the rig, and he had to assemble it himself. So he goes down to the IT group in Facebook and asks them for a SATA cable. They didn't have any. So I hear about this while I'm at home, and so I just grabbed a few from my personal stash and brought them in and solved the problem. But it had never occurred to me that Facebook wouldn't have basic hardware on hand, at least what I would consider basic hardware. Obviously, they hadn't needed it before, and that's why they didn't have it. But those are the little death of a thousand cut things that can slow you down if there are a lot of them. Then, of course, there are the team process differences. How they manage their game builds, testing, releases. How do they keep their management staff kind of looped in on the status of the game and the team? You saw this recently with Redfall. Microsoft says they were very hands-off with Arcane during the development, and as we saw, the results weren't great. The team clearly struggled, and the game is still recovering. I'm wondering how that experience will change Xbox and how they will interact with the new studios. My guess is you'll see several approaches based on the team, where they are in the ship cycle, and how well the game and team are doing. And the learning is going to go both ways. Part of why Microsoft found Activision so valuable is because of their mobile work. It's not going to be Microsoft telling King how to do things. It might be King telling Microsoft how to do things. You want to integrate the teams and learn from one another, but it can also go too far. I worked on Crimson Skies with the FASA team, and here's what Jordan had to say. They moved everybody into Microsoft Standard Organization, he said, and they changed his role so his staff was no longer reporting to him. I was creative director for the entire group, all 300 people, not just the 60 that came with me from Chicago, so that didn't help either. The good news is that Microsoft learned from that experience, and a year later, when they acquired Bungie, they moved them up to Seattle, but they gave them their own space. They even had a card key on the door, and if you weren't part of the Bungie team or someone who was critical to their team, you couldn't badge in. That had never happened at Microsoft before. It was a new thing, and that was Microsoft learning from their mistakes with FASA. Speaking of Bungie, it was reported recently that Sony sent Bungie to the Naughty Dog studio to review their multiplayer. The result is that The Last of Us multiplayer was put on ice. Sony has invested heavily in games as a service. As part of that push, it asked another of its video game studios, Seattle-based Bungie, to evaluate the games across its portfolio. Bungie raised questions about The Last of Us multiplayer project's ability to keep players engaged for a long period of time, which led to the reassessment. Activision has a lot of experienced people. They're stronger in mobile gaming than Xbox, so you're going to see these learnings going both directions. Acquisitions are always a challenge, but there's excitement too. The potential to do something great between these teams is there. I'm sure there are concerns, and there will definitely be conflicts. But it's possible for this to be a smooth transition, as long as Xbox stays focused on the teams and the people. If they can figure out how best to support them, they will win, because ultimately, the talented teams, the people at these companies, are what make or break the game. It would be great to see these teams helping each other and working together to revive some of these beloved franchises and bring them back to life. I'm personally excited by this news, and I hope it turns out well for everyone involved.